Hiya, and welcome back to Unsolicited. If you have ever wondered why small business conversations feel productive early on, but then turn tense or confusing later in the process, this episode is for you. Today, we're talking about the gap between how small businesses think federal contracting actually works and how decisions are made behind the scenes, and why that gap keeps creating the same problems over and over again. So if you want to learn more about conversations just like this, be sure that you like, subscribe, and tune in next time. Today, we have a very special guest, and she has spent years inside of the Small Business Administration enforcing rules that most people only learn about when something goes wrong. Sheena Little is the founder and principal of the Little Advantage Group, where she advises small businesses and organizations on how to compete, comply, and operate more effectively within the federal contracting space. Before that, she spent 24 years doing cradle to grave contract execution for the Air Force, and 13 years she worked for the Small Business Administration, most recently as the Deputy Director for Area 5 in the Office of Government Contracting, where she worked closely with procurement center representatives, eligibility reviews, and escalation processes across a pretty large region. When disagreements escalated between agencies, contracting officers, and industry, her office was the one and final stop. Sheena, welcome to Unsolicited.
Thank you.
We're super excited to have you on.
I'm excited to be here.
We have a lot to talk about, though, and the time is going to go really fast. Okay. And so we know that SBA doesn't make award decisions.
Right.
But it does play a critical role in defining eligibility, interpreting program rules, and advocating for how small businesses or small business programs are applied across systems or across the system. The perspective is exactly what we want from you today, is kind of how that happens. So getting right into it, many small businesses assume that when an outcome doesn't align with their expectations, that there's a mechanism someone can use to actually change it. Mm-hmm. How does that expectation compare to how authority and influence actually work in federal contracting? And where do problems tend to start when those two things don't line up?
So I would say that when a contract, when a firm has issues with a contract, they generally will come first. They try to resolve it with the contracting officer, and if they can't resolve it with them, they generally come to us. We're an additional level. Well, when I'm saying us, I'm referring to the Small Business Administration. They would generally come to the Small Business Administration for some assistance. But before, with the contract issues, I'm gonna need you to repeat that.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of these small businesses, mm-hmm. whenever they feel like an outcome didn't come the way mm-hmm. they thought it should, mm-hmm. that it's unfair to them mm-hmm. or in their mind's eye, that there's some mechanism that can actually change the outcome.
Okay. So in my experience, they come to us because they feel like the SBA can make a change. Sometimes we can make changes if we find that the whole contract execution process was wrong. We can advocate on behalf of that contractor. But a lot of times after that contract has closed or the solicitation has closed, it's not much we can do with, to help with that contract. We do encourage, the SBA does encourage the firms that are soliciting for those contracts to come to us before that solicitation closes, because after the solicitation closes, it's very limited things we can do. However, if there's blatant things that happen during that process, like the contracting officer didn't get back with them on on the during the question and answering session, or they can protest on behalf of, on their behalf, saying that this firm was not eligible for XYZ reasons. There's certain ways that the SBA can get involved to look at those protests and determine whether, they're valid or not. And that may change the outcome. Particularly with the SBA, they will look at a size protest. That is the one thing that the type of protest that falls under the SBA. So within a small business set aside, if a contractor feels that the apparent successful offerer is not small, then they can do a protest, and then the SBA will look at some information or get some information from the protested concern to determine whether they were actually eligible to receive that award.
So it's a misnomer to believe that going to the SBA after the award has a whole lot of things the SBA can do about it.
Yes. There's not a whole lot they can do, but after the solicitation closes, except for in that protest arena.
So their best bet is get to you ahead of time.
Absolutely.
If they feel like the contracting officer maybe isn't being responsive to your point, to their questions or whatever, like don't sit on that. Don't wait.
Right. Don't sit on that. Don't wait. If they're looking at the solicitation and they're saying, hey, this NAICS code does not align with the type of work that they're doing, and the contracting officer is like, no, this is a NAICS code I want to use, then they come to us and they say, hey, we don't think this is the right NAICS code, and here's why. And so, we can generally negotiate with the contracting officer, and then they will usually change the NAICS code if there's good evidence that that's not the right NAICS code, because they don't want a protest to happen against the NAICS, against the solicitation, because you can protest that solicitation. You can, they don't want that protest to happen and to stop work.
Progress.
Yeah.
So they don't want that any more than you do.
Absolutely.
So if you're feeling a way about it and you feel that you've got a valid complaint about it or something that needs to be looked into, do it ahead of the award.
Definitely stay ahead of the award.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So where do you often see that the misunderstanding occurs in the acquisition life cycle? Does a misunderstanding for what SBA can do for these small businesses, is that like they think that you're not going to be available to them until after something has happened? Or like, how do they know what you're offering and when is best to approach? Is it just accidental, or do you guys train them? Like, where does that information come from?
Okay, so that one's kind of double-sided to me, because for the Small Business Administration, when I worked there, this is all based on my experience working at the Small Business Administration, there are firms that say, ooh, I didn't even know you guys existed, and then there are firms that try to use us constantly, or try to use the SBA constantly to even be their business development specialist. It's like, no, we're not here to be your capture manager or your BDS person. We're here to advocate on your behalf. And so some of them use us for what we can do, and some of them are like, oh, I didn't know.
So that sounds like it would be a big misunderstanding if there's a vendor that believes that the SBA is there to help throw them in the way of opportunity, or
Yes, I mean we've had I've had experience with them wanting me to be their BDS person, to helping them write their proposals. We don't do that type of stuff. We don't even review your proposal. So we're there to advocate on their behalf during the solicitation process, or it usually is pre-solicitation. It's during the market research process. So what generally would happen within a requirement, it comes from the program manager who owns the requirement. Everybody has to do market research. The market research happens at the program management level. It happens with the contracting officer and the buyer. It happens with the small business specialist. And then when it comes to the SBA for the final look over, then the procurement center representative, they do additional market research. And they would generally do additional market research if the buying activity says, hey, we can't find any small businesses that can do this type of work. And because the procurement center representatives and the small business specialists, they take in capability meetings from firms, then they know, hey, I got a cadre of small businesses that I know can do this type of work. So we are going to request that this become a small business set aside versus it being full and open, meaning that, other than small business firms can compete for that.
Yeah, so you're saying that the SBA does a great job of keeping their ear to the ground for opportunities where they know multiple small businesses exist that can fulfill the requirements.
Absolutely.
And then advocate for that.
And the SBA actually has a database that everybody can use, and it's called the DSBS, the Dynamic Small Business Search. They can go to that database and they can type in NAICS codes. They can filter it through a specific organization. They can filter it through a socioeconomic category. They can use keywords or capability words, whatever. And it's every small business that's registered to do business with the federal government that allowed their profile, their SAM.gov profile, to be put into the dynamic small business search.
Oh, it's a good resource. So let's talk about where confidence collides with enforcement. So let's contrast how businesses assess themselves with how eligibility is actually evaluated, and then why that gap creates a surprise sometimes after award. So if a small business describes themselves as capable, experienced, ready to perform, but it doesn't always align with how eligibility is formally evaluated, from what you've seen, how does that gap between that self-assessment and the formal evaluation lead to problems?
Okay, I think it mainly leads to problems because a lot of small business, I'm going to say a lot, some small business think they can do a whole lot of things that they're not capable of doing. They may be an eligible small business, because to be eligible, you just need to be small in that NAICS code and be registered in SAM.gov. So you're eligible as a small business, but are you capable of doing that type of work? And so the capable portion, that has to do with capacity. Do you have the finances to do it? Do you have the past performance to do that type of work? And some of them, they don't read the solicitation fully. And when they don't read that solicitation fully, they don't understand that they can't do this type of work in the time frame that the government needs it at a fair and reasonable cost.
Yeah.
So, when they start looking at it, they'll just whip up a proposal. And it's like, this is not what we asked for. You can't meet these requirements. And, you really need to look at how the government is going to be evaluating this and show them how you can make these things happen.
Okay, so you're not saying small business, don't throw on your cape and believe you're capable when you're not. You're saying small business, if you're going to go after that, make sure you're prepared to answer for the requirement.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And we have seen where small businesses, and even other than small businesses, when they're looking at the solicitation, when we tell you, read the entire solicitation, because if we say we only want 20 pages and you give us 25, we're going to stop at page 20. And if all the meat of what you wanted to do is in those last 5 pages, you've missed it. But you need to read that solicitation fully and look at those, the requirements, and also look at those sections L and M. What are the requirements for the submission, and how are we going to evaluate that contract? If you can't meet those evaluation criterias, then maybe you're just not ready. You may can do some of it, but maybe you're not ready.
Now, you did this for some time in the Air Force, and then you did this again for the SBA. I'm assuming, just based on some of your body language, you saw this a lot, where vendors or small businesses weren't paying attention to the actual either market research or solicitation, trying to what the government was trying to buy and determine whether or not they were really a good fit for it.
Right. They just see something that falls in that NAICS code that they have in their profile, and then they're like, hey, I can do this. And the worst case scenarios that we've seen with the solicitation process is them just repeating back what the solicitation says. So if they say, hey, we need someone who can provide this certain resource by this certain time, and then they reply in the solicitation, we can supply it in that time frame, and that's all they
You're
say.
like, you're not telling me anything.
Yeah, you're not telling me anything on how you're going to do it, and anything like that.
Yeah.
But we have seen solicitations like that, and I honestly can say I've seen many solicitations like that where they're just repeating what's in the solicitation. And it's, when you're evaluating, it's like you're not giving me anything to evaluate how you're going to get this done.
That's
and
right.
to give any confidence that
And
you're
one
going
of
to
the
get it
things
done.
you said, it triggered a thought in me where you're like, they go in sometimes under cost, under budget, because they think that's going to get them the contract. And good news, they win. But bad news, they've won. Because what happens now? What have you seen, and how does that impact those organizations when they've done things like that?
Okay, so that's a double-edged sword for any firm, small or large, to come in and underbid just to get the contract, especially if it's an LPTA, the lowest price technically acceptable type of requirement. So they come in with the lowest price, and they are generally technically acceptable, and then they can't perform on that contract. And so now they
I know, me too.
yeah. So they come in at LPTA, and now they can't perform on the contract, and then they want to have a lot of changes done to the contract, and so they want these modifications to do this. Some firms believe that we'll pick up where we underbid through getting change orders on those contracts. But then the contracting officer is like, no, this is a firm fixed price contract. You give me what we asked for, and then when you cannot perform those those requirements, then that firm is really out there. They may get a bad rating, or they may get a termination, and if they get a termination, terminations don't look good. And when you get a termination, it's going to be really hard if it's not a termination for the convenience of the government. If you get a termination for cause or default, that's a pretty big red mark on your federal government resume.
Well, and I think the thing that's also important to mention is companies that put together the response to both market research and to the proposal, it's not free. That costs money. But not only do they lose that money if they get that red mark, but the government, it costs the government money too to go back out and try to find the vendor that's going to be able to provide what they need.
Right. And that makes the government lose confidence in small businesses when a firm is awarded a contract like that. They're like, no, I've worked with small business. This is what happened. And the SBA has to now convince them that, no, there are other small businesses that can do this type of work. It's just that contractor, underbid or didn't do something right. And now, you can't just peanut butter spread it to all of the contractors. But it's really, it gets really sticky because, they've lost all of this time and money with, doing those packages, evaluating them, and even with the contractor starting work. And now, you have to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds messy, actually. And so what I want to know is, what is it that tends to surprise firms most once the eligibility details, like classification, size thresholds, or financial requirements come into play? What do you find they were ill prepared for?
For the contracts that I've seen that I feel that they were ill prepared for was the capacity, them having the actual capacity. They may say on paper that they have the capacity, but in reality, they don't have that capacity. And they can do the work, but they can't provide it to the government in the time that the government needs it. So yeah, you have the experience or whatever, or the past performance to do this type of work, but if the government needs that work done in 30 days and it's going to take you 60 or 90 days, then that's where I see issues coming in. And that's the most time I see the issues coming in, is them not being able to perform in the time period that's allocated in the contract.
And they think they're doing themselves a favor by being quick, by answering the response, by quote unquote winning. But man, they're not doing themselves any favors when they're unable to actually provide the solution they said they were going to provide.
Absolutely.
That's both sad and scary, to tell you the truth. All right, so let's talk about how behavior diverges a bit from intent over the course of time, right? And so we won't assign any blame here, just but in a lot of environments, acquisition teams and vendors grow comfortable with working with the same partners again and again. It just becomes like the easy button. How does that comfort compare to the original intent behind small business programs? And what kinds of tensions emerge over time when that familiarity starts to outweigh some of the opportunities?
Okay, so when I see contractors contracting officers getting comfortable with certain contractors, usually that's kind of in our sole source environment, because most of the contracts are competed out, and so your proposal is what's going to win your contract. But with the SBA, you do have different set asides, and so the one in particular that comes to mind is our 8A program. It's the 8A Business Development Program, the SBA's 8A Business Development Program, and so that's a program where small disadvantaged businesses, certain disadvantaged business that have that 8A certification, they can get sole source awards up to a certain threshold. And so the contracting officer does not have to compete that requirement. And once that requirement is accepted into the 8A program, it's going to remain there. And so firms that are in the 8A program, they generally have 9 years in that program. And so if firm ABC gets that sole source award, and it's generally going to be a recurring requirement. When they get that award, they do well, for that whatever time period, if it's 2, 3, or 5 year time period, the contracting officer is going to want to come back to them because they know, they have proven that they can do well in this. Especially if it's a 1 year contract, every year we want to sole source back to that same vendor. And so the business opportunity specialists and even the small business specialists and the procurement center representatives, they have a responsibility to say, hey, let's try to spread the wealth. Now, that's only a recommendation. They can't make the contracting officer change to a different contract, but that's not the intent of, any of our small business programs, is to find that one contractor and keep going to them constantly until they graduate and then do another 9 years with another contract. We hear that mostly from the subcontracting program. So a lot of the small firms, they go for subcontracting opportunities with other than small businesses first, so they can get that experience base, and then when they do well with them, they've developed a partnership with that other than small or large business. And they just, they're in their repository. This is who we always go to for XYZ. And when I was a procurement center representative, that was one of the main things that complaints that I would hear about on the subcontracting side. It's like they don't even want, the small business. I mean, the large firms don't even want to look at other small businesses because they've done businesses with this one firm, and we can't tell a large business or other than small what to do with their subcontracting. So, it's kind of a, I don't know.
Yes.
We try to help them. We can make phone calls and say, hey, have you considered, doing some outreach to find other contractors? And sometimes they're like, no, we're comfortable with the team that we have. Yeah. And but they do have a requirement to meet certain small business goals with their through their subcontracting plan. So if that one small business that they're using for XYZ requirement, if they go other than small, then they have to find another small business vendor to help out in that portion of the contract.
So letter of the law versus intent of the law, right? The intent of the law was to allow small businesses to get their foot in the door.
Right.
But the letter of the law has seen some contracting officers go with the one that they've grown comfortable with, or has seen some of these other than small businesses continue with the small that they've gotten comfortable with. And so other smalls are kind of sitting on the outskirts wondering, like, put me in, coach, when's it my turn?
Right.
Yeah.
And I do want to emphasize that generally competition is going to get you that contract unless you're like in that 8-8 program and you have sole source opportunities. But other than that, competition is what the contracting officers strive for the most of the time, because competition drives competitive prices.
For sure. But to your original point, it isn't enough to get a sole source, because if you get into that contract and you're not performing, you can bet you've just sealed your own fate.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because the contracting officer wants to know, like, are you going to be a resource? And if you're immediately disqualifying yourself, that's a problem.
Right. In any contract, not even just in the sole source environment, if you're not performing, you're doing a disservice to your entire firm.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your point earlier, it also does a disservice to other smalls, because if you're a small and you underperform, then it does, like when the SBA goes to a contracting office and says, hey, I think there are multiple smalls that could do this, and you advocate for it to go as a set aside, and they're like, we're good.
They can't just stop it. We're
Yeah.
good.
Okay. So they don't have that choice, huh?
No, I'm not going to say that they don't have that choice, but if they do it, then there's things,
ramifications.
There's ramifications of doing it. So generally, when they say no, we're good, and we're like, no, we're not good, because we know that there are firms that can do this type of work. First of all, the small business specialist that supports that buying activity, they should be the first stop and say, no, Mr. Contracting Officer, we don't, this should not be a full and open competition. This should be a small business set aside, because we know 2 or more capable firms that can do this work at a fair and reasonable cost. And if contracting offers like, no, I don't care, I still want it to go full and open to get maximum competition. That's a little buzzword that they try to use. It's like, no, that's not what's statutorily required. The rule of two comes into place. If there are 2 or more small businesses that's capable of doing this at a fair and reasonable cost, then you shall set this aside as a small business set aside. And we have small businesses that can do this type of work. Now, the small business specialist can emphasize that, but the contracting officer can still say no, and then the small business specialist will then come to the procurement center representative at the SBA and say, hey, I lost this battle. It's your battle now. Here's the resources that I know of. The PCR would do additional market research and may find additional small businesses, and then advocate for a small business set aside. The one authority that the procurement center representatives have is they can stop that requirement, or I should say halt the requirement. And that's the worst thing that any agency wants to do, is halt a requirement. They're already on a stringent, timeline with their milestones. So they don't want that requirement halted, but it can come to a halt until that procurement center representative and the contracting officer come to an agreement, or it gets escalated to the area director to talk to like the commander. And it can also go up as far as the SBA administrator talking to that agency at that respective level, like at Air Force level or Army level. They have to come up to, with a decision on, what are we going to do here? The SBA is going to have their rationale as to why it should be small. And if the contracting officer still doesn't agree, then, they're going to have to come up with some type of negotiation. And that takes a long time, going through all of those levels. Throughout my career at the SBA, I only had to do, they call it the SBA Form 70. And that's the Form 70, that's the Small Business Administration recommendation. And so I've only had to do one, and it stopped really at the commander level, and we were able to negotiate it to still remain as a small business set aside. It was a small business set aside in the past, and then they wanted to open it up to a large, to full and open, and we're like, no, there's more than two or more, there's a
Yeah,
whole
there's
lot that can
plenty
do
of
this. Right.
opportunity or
Pretty.
options for vendors that are smalls to provide this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I love the idea that there is that advocacy coming out of the SBA just to make sure that we're staying on the right side of what right looks like, and someone is taking a look in and saying, hey, let's just talk about this. And even if you get the Heisman, like, we're good, you're like, this will really slow your process, right? If we don't at least discover if you could rethink that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think that it's really important that people understand that those conversations happen, and that it isn't just an absolute no all the time, that there can be room for those discussions to take place.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's see. How does that sort of comfort of, nope, that's the wrong question. I actually want to talk about this. So let's talk about from a systems perspective. We talk about systems perspectives all the time on how things impact and affect other things, right? When does that kind of drift maybe away from rule of two, or not considering SBA advocacies for different things, becomes significant enough that it starts to draw formal attention? Is it only at the point where the SBA representative files that Form 71? Or is it often handled before that?
Generally, we want to resolve issues at the lowest level possible. So it usually gets resolved, most of them that get resolved with the small business specialist and the contracting officer. And then I've seen most of, the other half, more than the other half, get resolved with the procurement center representative and the contracting officer. Because generally that procurement center representative is going to have some sound evidence that, hey, this should go as a small business set aside. The agency's top level or their commander of that organization, they don't want their procurement held up because there may be a contracting officer that's not pro small business. They just want to make it easy and say, hey, I just want to compete for all, because when it's full and open, small businesses can compete in a full and open requirement. Anybody can compete, but they're like, oh no, they're limiting competition. Yes, that's the purpose of a small business set aside, is to limit the competition just to small businesses. So generally those, the director of business operations and usually the contracting officers, they don't want their requirements being held up over something that they know that they really should be doing.
And I mean, you make a really good point when we're talking about the complaint that people have about, it's going to be all competition, or it's going to be all set aside. There's really not this large swing in either direction. It appears, at least for me, that there's quite a bit in both pools.
It is. It is. And market research drives what's going to be full and open, or set aside for just a small business set aside, or even further set aside to any of those socioeconomic categories. So the main thing that we try to preach to small business firms is that answer those requests for informations and those sources sought. And I did hear from several small businesses saying when they send out, when a contracting officer sends out a request for information or sources sought, they already know who they want. That is not true, because that is a market research tool for them. And so they're trying to see what small businesses out there can do this type of work. It is really hard for us, I keep saying us because I'm so recently retired from the SBA. It is really hard for the SBA to advocate on behalf of small businesses when they did not respond to the sources sought or the request for information, because that's a market research tool that they use.
Yeah.
And so when they don't respond, and we're looking at all the market research, especially, is that if there's only like 3 or 4 small businesses out there that can do that type of work, and they didn't respond to the sources sought or request for information, when we start looking into the weeds of what that contract actually requires, we may be like, we don't know if the couple of small businesses that we know of can actually do everything in this requirement. So answer the mail, and I think one of the other things is they're like, well, when I put out those, when I respond to those sources sought or those requests for information, we don't hear anything back. No, you won't more than likely hear anything back, because it's just a market research tool, and the procurement center representatives, they're going to look at the results of that market research that they've done, whether it was through that dynamic small business search, your sources sought, the request for information. All of that information comes in that requirement package to the procurement center representative to see if they did their due diligence to find small businesses. If they say, we had it out there for 30 days and no small business responded, it's really hard for us to advocate for a small business set aside when they don't respond to anything.
Say it louder for those in the back. Closed mouths don't get fed.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're basically saying, like, a lot of folks think like, I'm kind of there, or I know I could do it, but I'm not sure. Like, respond. Just respond. Let the government decide if you and a couple of other smalls have an opportunity to fulfill this requirement. It might give that as an option to be set aside.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you heard it, folks. Get out there, respond to that market research. Sheena, this has been really fun. I feel like I could pick your brain all day long. Thank you so much for helping us unpack just how this system tends to work, because when we talk about knowing what something is, knowledge, like G.I. Joe used to say all the time, knowing is half the battle.
Right.
So, okay. So we have to know why misunderstandings around this thing keeps happening. And so I think that you've unpacked a lot of that for us, and I appreciate it. If you want to learn more about Sheena, you can find her out on LinkedIn. If this episode resonated with you, make sure that you check out our previous episode with Stacey K. Vaughn, which why one size fits all fails in GovCon. We were digging into how assuming the government is a single uniform customer is just the fastest way that we lose credibility, trust, and ultimately contracts. So if you haven't already, be sure to like, subscribe, turn on your notifications, and then join us next week with cybersecurity expert David Spud Webb. We'll see you then right here on Unsolicited.